So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining from, what country you're joining from. And welcome to the live webinar. Here's how a vendor self-registration portal can add security and validation to vendor banking. And I am not getting an indication of what screen you're viewing. So if you're not able to see the presentation, please put that in either chat or the question section, and then I will fix that. But I think you're able to see the presentation, so I will continue. Now, some housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording within 3 days, but most likely it will be tomorrow. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. I will save them for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. If I don't get to all of your questions during the Q&A session, additional questions can be asked via email. And then lastly, please don't forget to download the handouts. It's a PDF of the presentation and a 2021 training schedule for the vendor team training pass that we'll talk about towards the end. Okay. And for those of you that are attending one of my webinars for the first time, I do want to introduce myself. I am Debra Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy, because I love AP. As a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, I was responsible for maintaining 140,000 active global vendors across 7 different ERPs. Now, we did select a third-party provider, and a vendor self-registration portal was implemented for those 140,000 active vendors. It took 18 months, some gray hair, a few pounds, and then I went to work for that third-party provider and design that same portal solution for other clients. Now, I keep up with available portals in my consultancy and try to provide relevant information to those that are thinking about implementing a vendor portal, and thus this is the webinar. I do have a site dedicated to the vendor setup and maintenance process where I have some free and paid resources and tools, including a blog, a podcast, some free downloads, on-demand webinars, anything to help you with your vendor process. I also have weekly trainings and Q&A sessions for vendor teams that sign up, and again, we'll talk about that a little later. So let's review the agenda. We will first look at my proprietary 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process. Then we'll talk about the good and the bad with vendor portals. Then we will get into security access roles and features, as well as the vendor bank validations and features. And then again, we will wrap up with a Q&A session. So let's first talk about my proprietary Authentication.Validation.Management. Again, it is a 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process system. And so the first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. The data source is who is sending. The delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. So if you have a vendor self-registration portal, you would rely on the delivery method to confirm, since the login requirement authenticates the data source. If you, however, are still relying on email, fax, or hard copy, then you want to authenticate the data source. And for anyone that is interested interested, I do have a free on-demand recording of a webinar called Protecting Vendor Bank Details when you receive changes via email beyond that phone call, because when everyone went home for the pandemic, it was hard getting anybody on the phone. That gives steps to add authentication in the existing vendor change process. It also gives an option to eliminate that confirmation phone call. Now, step 2 is validation, and that's where you want to validate vendor data before it is entered into your ERP. Some of that of which we will talk about today with the vendor validations for banking that's in the portal. But to help with that, if you're still doing that manually, I do have a free download. It is a vendor validation reference list with resource links, and it identifies not only resources to verify a vendor is real and not on any watch list, but it's also divided based on the type of information being validated and on which vendor document you'll find it, such as the invoice. Now, the third step is management, where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file on a consistent basis. It also includes different best practices and internal controls to maintain that data. But basically, you need to make sure you inactivate vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18 or 24 months. You check for duplicate vendors and then revalidating the remaining active vendors data. And the tools, I do have a free on-demand webinar where I show you the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file when you're doing it manually. I also have one where I'm talking about the tools as well. So when you click on the webinar links, you'll be taken to my YouTube channel, and you'll see all of the webinars. I have them in one playlist, and the webinars are really great because they do have timestamps, so you can jump around as you need to. But there's one on there where I talk about the tools that I use to clean vendor master files as well. Okay. And then I also have an e-guide that includes 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and 13 best practices, along with, again, other considerations when onboarding and maintaining vendors. And that really goes into depth with the authentication, validation, management, 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process. So now that you see my entire process, let's look at vendor self-registration portals. Okay. Oh, but before we do that, I am going to launch the first poll. And what I'd like to know is, where are you in your vendor self-registration portal journey? So let me launch that. And so if you can answer, do you already have a live portal? Do you have a portal project that is underway? Like, are you right in the middle of a project? Are you currently in the RFP stage or completing or sitting through those third-party provider demos? Or are you at the beginning stage where you're creating a business case and an ROI to get approval for leadership? Or E, not thinking about it at all. Although I don't think anyone should select E since you're on this webinar, so you're probably thinking about it. But go ahead, I'll give you about 10 more seconds to answer, and then we will go from there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I will close it. And then I will share. So it looks like we have 20% have a portal project underway. That's great. And I do have something that if I have time, I'll share with you that'll possibly help in the implementation phase with your internal team members. And then 80% are creating a business case or our return on investment for leadership to approve. Okay, so that's good to know who we have on the call. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that, and then we will continue to actually starting and looking at the pros and cons of the portals. And I think it's important to share since there is some commonality across the use of portals. Okay. All right, so the pros. And I do want to say here that there are probably way more pros, definitely way more pros out there, but these are the biggest ones, especially as we continue with the pandemic and increased fraud. And so the biggest one, I think, is just getting that vendor sensitive information out of email. So if you have your vendor submitting supporting documentation directly to the vendor team, then you can use the portal to get vendor sensitive personal information out of email. And if those W-9s, for example, can include a social security number, if you're dealing with a sole proprietor or a single member LLC that does not have employees, at that point, then they're not required to get an EIN. You only need an EIN if you have payroll. And so you could be dealing with SSNs, and then of course, banking information. Now, the second one, if you have your internal team members collecting that supporting documentation and then submitting it to the vendor team, you can use the portal to get that vendor sensitive personal information out of the hands of your internal employees. Because one of the biggest things that I found when implementing our portal, going through that journey, was that the internal employees that are collecting that information, they're not destroying, that W-9 that has an SSN on it. They're not destroying that banking information they collect. They're keeping that in case they ever have to collect it again. It was hard for them to get it in the first place. They really did not want to do it again in the first place. And so if they ever have to get that information again, they want to already have it, which of course is not against the whole reason why the vendor team would ask for that information again, is to get that updated information. They don't want the old W-9, the old banking information. If we ever ask for it again, in most cases, we want to make sure we have updated information. So it's not good that they're keeping it, and who knows where or how they're keeping it, on their C drive, in the email, or for that matter, where they even got it from. I mean, they could have gotten it from crook.com. Now, the other pro, which has really made a big difference when I implemented the portal, was that it standardized the collection process. So if, like me, you have multiple accounting systems or ERPs, then you know that you can have different requirements or even different methods to submit a vendor request or even create a vendor. Now, with a supplier portal, it will standardize how you collect the information, what information is collected, and if you have it feeding directly to your accounting system or ERP, then you don't have to worry about different processes to add or update an existing vendor that you need to teach to your vendor team. And I am not kidding when I say when we had those 7 different ERPs before we implemented the portal, I had 158 process docs that identified or that documented processes within the vendor team. Now that's a lot. And keep in mind, you had to have a process doc for each different process, and then for each different process you had to have a different one for each different ERP. And so standardizing the collection of the documents and that process really reduced our documentation down and just made it easier to onboard vendors or vendor team members. Okay. Now, some cons. Those 20% of you that are in the middle of a implementing a portal may have already seen some of these or may be upcoming. So the first one is the internal team members can be the biggest detractors, right? They are the ones that actually have a relationship with the vendors, and they can introduce your portal as good or bad, no matter the functionality of the actual portal. So to combat that, you want to make sure you include large stakeholder groups, groups that submit large volume of vendor requests. We had that, maybe you do too. Include them early in the process using surveys, emails, and other ways to keep them up to date on the instructions, training, and status. For us, we used an intranet page. Another thing that we used was we scheduled recurring training calls with internal team members. Some may join the calls regularly, not really to ask questions, but they would jump on to see what other people were asking. So those actually really did work well. We had a weekly recurring call. The next one is vendor adoption can be low if you do not require registration within the portal. So you do want to require the use of the vendor portal, but in turn, you want to make sure you communicate often with the vendor in advance. Also, you want to provide instruction within the portal in PDF, video, even chat format if your portal allows that, to avoid those abandoned registrations because they did not know how to complete or answer the questions. And we'll get to that in the next one too. But for existing vendors, the best practice is to only invite those that have a purpose in the portal, such as when they have to have updates to their vendor data. So you don't necessarily need to have all the vendors come to the portal to register when you first implement. You really only need those that have updates, and then of course invite your new vendors to the portal. Now for new vendors, it's in the invitation email that your internal stakeholders or purchasing, procurement will send. Just make sure they have access to training and that it's required, and that that requirement is included in the invitation email. Now the other con is, when you get a portal and you're configuring that portal, you tend to want to go Christmas shopping. We did, but we were quickly and rightfully stopped by the third-party provider, because you want to make it as easy as possible to get what you need to make those successful payments, remain compliant with regulatory agencies, and reduce fraud risk. You want to make sure you reduce the number of fields or the required fields. Do things like provide hover text with explanations of each field. Some portals do offer that. And then you also, if available, offer a choice of default languages. And then just set realistic expectations. In your invitation email, you will typically include how long it will take to fill out the registration. Don't say 10 to 15 minutes, and then when they click, expecting 10 to 15 minutes, the vendor is in the portal, for longer than that. And I have seen those situations happen, and what ends up happening is the vendor will just abandon the registration. And so you don't want that to happen, because now you have to track that too. So now as we move, now that we talked about the pros and the cons, as we move to talking about security and bank validations, I do want to add a disclaimer. Since portals are continuously evolving, I probably would have left something out. So if there's something in your vendor registration portal that you're implementing or that you've demoed, feel free to put that in the chat or the questions, and I'll share that with everyone towards the end. But one of the biggest things I think that you can do to make sure that you're aware of what your vendor self-registration portal has is to make sure you obtain a copy of the manual. Read it from cover to cover, whether it's electronic. Most of them are electronic, and most of the third-party providers do have it, so that you know what is available and what's configurable. But still keep in mind, you're not moving your current process to a portal. Rather, you're implementing a new process, taking advantage of technology to remove fraud and just add efficiency. All right. So now let's move into security access roles and what those features are can be available in the vendor self-registration portal. Okay. So these security access roles, they may be configurable in the portal by the third-party provider, or they may need to be handled by your IT team or a combination. So the first one is the vendor registration email. So that invitation email that you send to the vendor to register. If possible, see if your third-party provider will allow you, some do, to separate those emails. So typically when you get that invitation email, it will have the username and password in the same email. You want to separate those into separate emails, and that reduces the potential for fraud. And some third-party providers can do that. So if possible, you want to separate those two emails. The next one is inactivity logout. So you want to require the vendor to log in again after a set period has elapsed. And I know when we implemented the portal, as the clients, we were, or users, we were able to set whatever that period was. I think we did 15 or 30 minutes, but as a consultant working with some clients that had me register in their vendor self-registration portals, I will tell you that, you know, for the 2-week period that I had that project, I registered once, and then for the rest of the time, I only had to type in, you know, a portion of the address, and it took me right back within the portal without having to log in. So I did let them know about that security issue. So make sure that that does not happen in your portal. And if that is an issue, bring in your InfoSec team or your IT team to work on that. And then the next thing is single sign-on, and this is where there is no login required. Some portals have this available for both internal employees and vendors. And for internal employees, you'll need to work with your IT team, since a status will need to be sent to the vendor portal daily. So if you have an employee that leaves, you don't want them to have the single sign-on ability the next day or the day after they leave. So there always has to be that feed with whatever their employment status is. But it can be a big convenience for those internal employees or vendors. But again, you need to determine what's best for your company's security requirements. I am actually only aware of, and I'm sure it's more, but I am more aware of single sign-on for internal internal employees and only aware of one instance where that was done for the vendors. Now, the next one is, and you hear this a lot, is that multi-factor or two-factor authentication. And while this is not foolproof, especially in scenarios such as email account takeover, which we hear about a lot now, it will trigger an additional authentication. Some portals require MFA at each login, which can be a little much for vendors, and some don't require it at all. It's typically something that you can configure or you can customize, but some other systems will be configurable to only require MFA. For example, if the vendor's login is from a different IP address, company, etc. So it can be at each login, it can be not at all, or it can be triggered by some event like coming in from a different IP address, different computer. So you don't have to require it as often, only if something changes. Now, the next one is least privilege access. So wherever vendor banking is stored, right? So ERP, other third-party tool, vendor portal, access to the full bank account really needs to be limited. Only give access to sensitive vendor information such as the tax ID, banking information, if you collect the birth date, which in one of the portals I had to register for my client. They did collect my birth date, but it's normally only required in certain countries like Italy, or the IRS will require it for individuals completing a W-8 under certain scenarios. But in any event, you only want to give access to that sensitive information to internal employees that need it. Consider masking all except the last 4 digits of a sensitive number, such as a tax ID, when it's really only needed to make sure they have the right vendor record. So the last 4 or 5 digits of a tax ID is more than enough for an internal employee that's not in AP or that is not in the vendor team within AP to make sure they have the right vendor record. And then, of course, you want to make sure you include the portal on the internal employee transfer termination list, so that if an internal employee is transferred or leaves, that they are removed from the portal access, their security access is removed. And then you just want to do a recurring security role audit to ensure access is removed, again, as their tasks change or they leave the company. And also, I'm not sure about you, but I was not up to date or knowledgeable on security requirements, audits, etc., related to vendor self-registration portals. So make sure you work with your IT and or your information security or InfoSec team to vet the vendor portal. Third-party providers are subject to in-depth risk questionnaires, so they're used to that. And they're also will provide you with their SOC 1 and SOC 2 certifications, which are audit certifications. SOC 1 is the reporting on internal financial information, and then SOC 2 is all of the requirements for privacy and security and that type of thing. I do have a blog post on that if you want to just go on my site and search for SOC 1 or SOC 2, SOC 1, SOC 2. And then you'll see what that means and what's included in there. Okay. And then, so before we get to the vendor bank validations and features and self-registration, vendor self-registration portals. So here's our second poll question. So I'm curious, again, we're going to talk about the bank validations in the portal. I would like to know what you guys are doing now. And so let me grab the second one. And so I'm going to launch. So do you validate bank account ownership? And if you do, how do you currently do it? Do you use early warning and GIAC, which basically is a database that US banks contribute to, and then early warning and GIAC is the reseller. They will check against that database. NS-Knox is another company out there, and they also do it for international. So early warning and GIAC is US only, but NS-Knox is US and international, and that's because they use a pre-note process to validate bank account ownership. Do you work with your bank, which is the other option here, the bank, the beneficial owner? So do you work with your bank, maybe send them a file so that they can compare the vendor legal name with the bank account holder's name, perhaps the tax ID, compare that with the tax ID that was used to open the bank account? Or do you use other options such as a pre-note within your ERP, and then of course if you do not verify your bank account ownership, select E. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to close it and give you about 5 more seconds if you want to vote. All right, so I will close that and let's take a look at the results. So we have 67% says you do not verify bank account ownership. And then 33% says other, meaning you're most likely, I would guess, doing it as a pre-note within your ERP. The only thing I don't like about the pre-notes, if you're doing it within your ERP, is that pre-notes don't always come back with a bank account holder name because the banks are not required to provide that. And so they don't always work as well as some of the other options. But this is probably, if you're using that, it's probably something that's included in your with your bank and in your contract with your bank. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And so now let's look at vendor bank validations features in a vendor self-registration portal. All right, so the first thing that some vendor bank validations or some vendor self-registration portals, third-party providers will include is the bank branch details, that validations. Some vendor portals will have the ability to validate the routing number, the SWIFT code, BIC code if they're non-US, and the IBAN format, as well as the bank address. There is one portal out there that if you just put in the routing number, it will automatically feed back the bank address. And so that can be very beneficial, especially those that have SAP. And we all know how convoluted, and it's probably been on your to-do list for a while, but how convoluted that bank table can be in SAP. So at least there's a validation available within some portals. Now, where this does not exist, the vendor team will need to validate separately. The next one is bank account ownership, that validation. So some vendor portals will have the ability to link via an API to a service such as early warning or GIAC systems. And I actually tested that within a portal to match that vendor legal name to the bank account holder name. Now, for this to work, you will need to have a separate account with those services. And then once you have that, your third-party provider will link to it. If that option does not exist within your third-party provider's vendor self-registration portal, then again, if your company chooses to perform the validation and has an account with the service provider, the vendor team will need to validate that separately. But that validation is possible. And again, GIAC and early warning is domestic, U.S. banks, but NS-NOX can do, they do have a separate, they don't necessarily connect with a vendor self-registration portal. At least I'm not sure if they do, but they do have connections directly to your ERP. So for example, that SAP bank table I was talking about that's never clean, they do have a way to make sure that that information is validated before it's sent over to SAP. And they do have an API where it's connected. And so that can help out in that regard. Now, the next one is the branded banking ACH form. And if you've listened to any of my other webinars, read my blogs, podcasts, you know that if you're collecting vendor bank information manually, then I always recommend a branded banking ACH form, company branded banking ACH form. Now, if you have or are getting a portal, you don't need to abandon it because not all vendors will be able to maintain their own registration, either because they are a government, a regulatory agent, or just a vendor that refuses to adopt it. So there will always be internal employees that will need to register on behalf of the vendor. And that means that the internal employee will need to collect the vendor banking from the vendor and then upload that into the portal. And for that, you want to make sure that the vendor still completes a company branded banking ACH form that includes authenticating data such as old banking, tax ID, remit address, to reduce the potential that banking information was collected from a fraudster. So portals, again, you'll always have an instance or scenario where you'll need to collect the branded banking ACH form. And so your portal should have the ability to upload that form. Now, the next one, the OCR and the doc type, this kind of goes along with the branded banking ACH form, but it works for other forms as well. So where the proxy has collected the banking information on that form, or if you require it from your vendors, or have some other form that's unique, some portals can specify a specific doc type that can verify that the uploaded document is the required form versus a random picture. So I know when we were doing testing, when we were implementing our portal, we would upload pictures of dogs, pictures of cats, whatever we had a random picture of. But there are some portals out there that do have OCR. And so they can't just, your vendors or internal employees just can't upload a random picture in order to get through the registration. But for the doc types, if you have a doc type that says, for example, that it is the banking ACH form, then an added benefit is that it allows the vendor team or the audit team to search by a specific doc type. So that can be available. Now, the next one is audit logs. Now, even though the vendor portal may not be the system of record, and in most cases it's not, that activity should still be audited. Either as part of your regular vendor process audits or audits implemented to compensate for segregation of duties issues, etc. Those audit logs should be available to check for activity, just as with your ERP. I know when we implemented our portal, we already had a vendor process audit that was completely separate from our regular regular AP audits. We had a monthly audit, and so the activity was pulled into that monthly audit because we weren't doing anything on the vendor record within the ERP, so that had to move to the portal. Now, for those of you that have already selected a vendor self-registration portal, if any of these security access roles, features, and vendor bank validation or features are not in your portal, again, because they are all different. I mentioned it with a lot of the vendor banking validations. You will just need to supplement it with manual processes, those that you deem required for your vendor setup and maintenance process. And I will say again, portals are always evolving. They're always adding new functions and features. And if there's something within the security or the bank validations that's in your portal that I did not mention here, again, put that in the questions or the chat, and I will bring that up at the end to share that with everyone. So now that we've done that, we're going to go to our third and last poll question. And that is, it should be coming up now. So that is, do you currently have vendor process team training? And when I say vendor process, I mean specifically training on vendor onboarding and existing vendor updates, those types of things where we have seen especially with this pandemic, but even before then, those vendor team members have been targeted by fraudsters because they're the ones that are in charge of the vendor sensitive information that they want to change so that they can divert payments. So whether they're, it's the change my bank account scheme or scam, or even the remit address, because it can happen with checks as well. So we've really seen an increase in the vendor team receiving those fraudulent emails. So do you have a vendor process team training that's specific to the vendor process? All right, so about 10 more seconds to go ahead and answer yes, no, not sure. I'm not sure why I put not sure in there. If you answer not sure, that probably just needs to be a no, because if it's not sure, it means you haven't had it. So go ahead and answer that. All right, so I'm going to close and then let's share. All right, so 67% of you said yes, so that is really good. And 33% said no. And I would also, include you in, or include those folks. I'm not sure how you answered. If you have some access to training for AP overall, yes, it does include some vendor process training. However, I think nowadays, especially as we're having an increase in fraud, and also work from home, that's really complicating the vendor onboarding and existing vendor changes, especially that focused vendor process team training is just really required. And so let me go and hide that. And with that, I do want to show you here that there is some vendor process team training available. So again, for those that have or have already selected a vendor self-registration portal, again, if any of those security roles, vendor bank validations features are not in your portal, you will need to supplement it with manual processes. And then for those of you that don't yet have the vendor self-registration portal, again, this will be very valuable because it does focused on the vendor process side. And I actually, again, did attach the 2021 training schedule. And so we talk a lot about the vendor process, and it's very interactive. It is one rate for the whole team. Your training is solved. That training pass has weekly live training sessions. Again, that's interactive. It has a weekly Friday Q&A session. Is really drop in, and it's a 2-hour period. So you can drop in, ask your question, and then leave. I will be on the whole 2 hours. You don't have to be there right at the top of the hour. I also do monthly new frauds and how to combat them. It's the last Thursday of every month. And then you also get access to a free e-guide, and then also free templates and forms, including that vendor, that company branded ACH form I talked so much about. And then here is a list of my other resources. And by the way, with the vendor team training pass, if you email me and take a look at the 2021 training schedule and then email me, you will be able to attend a complimentary session of your choice. So if you see one you like, you want to try it out, email me and I will add you to that session. But I do have plenty of free resources on the left here. I do have that free vendor validation reference list that I talked about earlier. I have a free desktop procedure template if you need to document your processes for download, so you can have that. If you're just fresh from having to track down and collect those expiring W-8s that expired the third year, 12/31 of the third year, and you want to find a better way to track it, you can download a free W-8 expiration date tracking form. And again, I do have free live. I do monthly webinars that are free. And then once I'm done with those, I put them on demand. And so you can access them from my website. And again, it'll take you to a YouTube channel, and all of the on-demand webinars have timestamps so you can jump around. And then I did want to include how to connect with me, especially on YouTube, where I have a weekly vendor master file tip of the week. So make sure you subscribe. I do that every Tuesday. And then I also have a podcast, and the link to that page is here as well. The podcasts are on YouTube as well. And then feel free to follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and subscribe to get my weekly email so you can be kept up to date on all things vendor maintenance. All right, so now we're going to go to the question section. And I do have a question here, so let me get to that. So the first one is, if you move to a vendor self-registration, and I'll just put in portal, does every vendor need to use it? Thinking about a utility company and such that will not use it. So, so a couple of things with portals. First of all, you do not have to go live with all of your vendors at once. So if you decide that all of your vendors are going to eventually be in the portal, you can do it in phases, right? And then that'll keep you from being overwhelmed. That'll keep your internal team members from being overwhelmed. And you can then like perfect your outreach based on, you know, how you did it with the first wave of vendors. In addition to that, I've also seen it where some users or some companies for their portals will segment it by vendor type. So they won't put all vendor types in the portal. So this one in the question, it talked about a utility company. And so companies that have a vendor type such as government or regulatory agency or what's another one? Utilities. Those is not something that will be in the portal, because those are things that either the vendor team or the internal team members will proxy. I will say, when we implemented our portal, we put all of our vendors in there. And so if there were utility companies, government, regulatory agencies that we knew would not register, those were just registrations that had to be proxied or filled in on behalf of those vendors by either the internal team members or the vendor team. And so because again, when I implemented it, we had those 7 different ERPs, we had 7 different ways of onboarding a vendor, and I wanted one way to collect and onboard and update vendors. I wanted one way, and so I put them all into the portal, and those vendors that could not register, we would proxy either for internal team members or within the vendor team would proxy those. All right, so the next question, what are some other validations that can be available in vendor portals? So these kind of vary, but most of them will have the IRS 10 match, and most will have OFAC and other watch lists. Some will have Dun & Bradstreet. If you have a separate account, they can API into Dun & Bradstreet, and some companies do get hierarchy information from there. They do get credit information from there. And so if you already have an account and you want that information to be part of the vendor registration or the vendor profile within the portal, some companies do offer that those options. I will say that, you know, the cost of the portals can be from, you know, 5 to 6 figures per year. And as you go up, there are, of course, more validations and more features that are available. Some portals, I will say, even you know, they don't have a lot of functionality in them, but as long as they can get that vendor sensitive information out of email, I still think it's worth it. But again, for most portals, if there is a validation resource and that resource has an API, it can be added to a portal. Another thing I will say too is that many portals have what they consider golden records from previous validations, and they may be able to populate your missing vendor data. So I know when I was implementing a portal, and those 20% that said you're implementing portals, if you're at a stage where you have on your to-do list to clean your vendor master file, I already understand that half of those things won't get done, but some companies will allow you to populate your missing vendor data with their golden records, and so it can save you a step. Okay, so those were the only 2 questions that I've seen. If you have any additional questions or any more questions, just go ahead and type them into the question section, and I will answer those. We have about 8 minutes left, and so I will stay on. While you're thinking about that, one of the things that I'm usually asked is about related to my specific journey with global vendor portals or vendor self-registration portals, is were you able to eliminate any positions? And I really didn't look at it like that. We didn't eliminate any positions, one, because I knew, you know, if we eliminated positions, we would never get those positions back. And positions in accounts payable, once you have them, you want to keep them. And so what we did is we assign vendor team members to more value added tasks. So there are always things that can be approved. improved, or things that are just not being done that are more value added, and they weren't being done because we didn't have anyone to do it and we couldn't get another position. And so those vendor team members were just assigned to those more value added tasks. And when you're doing your, for those of you that are, doing your business case ROI, make sure that you include, those benefits in your business case. They can be, soft benefits. It doesn't have to have a value attached to them, but if leadership is looking for a decrease in FTEs or a decrease in positions, just show them the benefit of what you will be able to do with those reassigned team members, because that's actually what we did. All right, any other questions? Okay, I don't see any more questions. If you think of questions after the webinar, feel free to email me at Debra@DebraRRichardson.com, and I will reply most likely within 24 hours with an answer to that. And then I do want to thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar is now concluded.